In this episode, we're going to take a very practical look at hallucinations, which is the everyday name people use when a model produces information that sounds confident but is not actually true. For beginners, the tricky part is that hallucinations often look like helpful answers, not like obvious mistakes. The model may give a clean explanation, a specific number, or a believable reference, and it can feel trustworthy because the writing is smooth. In security work, though, smooth writing is not evidence, and a wrong detail can lead to a bad decision. The goal here is not to treat models like they are useless or dishonest, but to learn simple patterns that reduce hallucinations and make it easier to notice when one might be happening. When you ground the model in real sources, constrain what it is allowed to claim, and use verification patterns that match the task, you turn the model from a confident guesser into a safer assistant. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To reduce hallucinations, you first need a clear understanding of why they happen. A language model is trained to predict plausible text, and that means it is excellent at producing something that looks like an answer even when the prompt does not contain enough facts. When asked a question that requires a specific, up-to-date, or niche detail, the model can fill in the missing pieces with patterns it has seen before. That filling in might be correct sometimes, but the danger is that the model cannot always tell the difference between what it knows, what it is inferring, and what it is inventing. In cybersecurity, we regularly deal with details that change quickly, like advisories, versions, threat actor names, and timelines, and those are exactly the types of details where a model is most likely to guess. Practical reduction starts by designing interactions so the model has less opportunity and less incentive to guess. Grounding is the first big lever, and it simply means tying the model's output to something real and identifiable. Grounding can be done by providing trusted reference material directly in the prompt, by using a retrieval step that brings in relevant documents, or by requiring the model to answer only from a defined set of sources. When the model has text in front of it that contains the facts, it no longer has to invent them, and it can quote, summarize, or explain with less risk. Even for a beginner, it helps to think of grounding like open-book testing versus closed-book testing. If you ask the model to answer a detailed question without giving it the book, it may try to write an answer anyway. If you hand it the exact page, you are changing the task from inventing to interpreting, and that is a safer mode. Grounding also involves being picky about what counts as a good source. A trustworthy internal policy document, a vendor advisory, or a well-maintained knowledge base is a stronger foundation than a random snippet from an unverified blog. In practice, you often want to set a default rule like use only the provided context, and if the context is insufficient, say so and ask for more. That rule sounds simple, but it directly prevents a common hallucination pattern where the model tries to be helpful by making up missing facts. Security teams sometimes call this refusing to speculate, and it is a habit you want models to learn. If the question is about what happened in a specific incident, the model should be able to say what it can prove from the available evidence and clearly label what it cannot. Constraints are the second big lever, and constraints are basically guardrails on what the model is allowed to do. A useful constraint is narrowing the scope of the answer to what the user truly needs. If the user asks for a quick explanation of a concept, you do not need the model to provide a list of dates, vendors, and version numbers, because those details may not be stable or necessary. Another constraint is limiting the output format to reduce free-form storytelling. When the model is encouraged to write long, flowing text with lots of details, it has more opportunities to introduce incorrect specifics. When you constrain it to short, structured responses, such as a definition, a short explanation, and a list of assumptions, you reduce the surface area for hallucinations. A third type of constraint is to require the model to separate facts, inferences, and unknowns. Even without using tables or bullet lists, you can do this in plain narrative by explicitly labeling statements as directly supported, likely but unconfirmed, or not known from the provided information. This is not about making the answer awkward. It is about making the model's reasoning visible. In security, You rarely want a single blended narrative that mixes observation and interpretation as if they are the same thing. If the model can keep those categories separate, you can use it more safely for analysis and communication. This also helps you as the listener because it trains you to notice where the model is leaning on assumptions. Verification patterns are the third lever, and they are about how you check whether the output is reliable enough for your purpose. A simple verification pattern is the two-source rule for important claims, meaning you do not treat a single statement as true unless it is supported by at least two independent trusted references. In a real organization, the sources might be your ticketing system plus endpoint telemetry, or a vendor advisory plus an internal scan result. For a beginner, the mindset is the same. If the claim matters, you verify it in a way that matches the risk. If the model says a vulnerability is exploitable remotely, that is a high-impact claim, so you would verify against authoritative sources rather than trusting the model's phrasing. Another verification pattern is asking the model to show its work using only the context it was given. That sounds like a school exercise, but it can catch hallucinations because the model has to point back to the evidence it used. If it cannot connect the conclusion to the provided facts, you have a signal that it may be guessing. In many safe designs, the model is instructed to cite the specific parts of the provided context that support each key claim. Even when you are not using citations, you can still require the model to tie claims to the evidence in plain language, such as stating that a conclusion is based on a log entry, a policy excerpt, or a particular alert description. This pattern reduces the chance that the model will add extra details that feel consistent but are not actually supported. There is also a verification pattern that is very practical for security: consistency checking across perspectives. For example, if the model produces an incident summary, you can ask it to cross-check the summary against the raw alerts, then cross-check again against a timeline, then identify any contradictions. A hallucination often creates tiny inconsistencies, like a time that does not match, a system name that is not in the logs, or a sequence of events that cannot happen in that order. Models are actually good at spotting contradictions when asked directly, because contradiction detection is a language task. The key is to prompt for verification explicitly rather than hoping the model will self-correct on its own. You are using the model as both the writer and the editor, but you are forcing the editor role to look for evidence and conflicts. One of the most helpful practical techniques is to constrain the model's permission to name specifics. You can tell it, in the developer instructions or in your own prompting style, not to invent identifiers like version numbers, CV IDs, threat actor names, or product feature names unless they appear in the provided context. These are exactly the details that models tend to hallucinate because they have predictable formats and because naming something makes the answer feel authoritative. If you have ever seen a model produce a plausible-sounding CV that does not exist, that is what is happening. A safer approach is to have the model speak in ranges or categories unless specific details are confirmed, and to explicitly request clarification when the question requires a precise identifier. Another practical method is to narrow the question until it matches the available evidence. Many hallucinations come from asking broad questions that require lots of missing context, like what caused this incident or how do we fix it? If you instead ask what evidence do we have and what are the possible explanations, the model is less likely to invent a single definitive story. In beginner terms, you are turning a big mystery question into smaller evidence questions. This also mirrors how good incident response works, because responders usually begin by gathering facts and scoping impact before jumping to conclusions. When you align the model's task with that workflow, you reduce the risk that it will fabricate a neat narrative. It is also worth understanding that hallucination risk changes with the type of task. When you ask for a definition or a high-level explanation, hallucinations are less dangerous because you can keep the answer conceptual and stable over time. When you ask for anything that depends on current events, specific vendor details, or the exact content of a policy, hallucination risk goes up because the task is fact-heavy. For those fact-heavy tasks, grounding and verification are not optional extras. They are core safety requirements. In other words, you should train yourself to look at a question and decide if it is a concept question or a fact question. That single mental step helps you decide whether you can accept a model's output as a learning aid or whether you need to validate it like you would validate any untrusted claim. A pattern that security teams like is to treat the model's output as a draft that must pass a checklist before it becomes a decision. The checklist might include questions like whether the output is supported by evidence, whether it includes unsupported specifics, whether it clearly states assumptions, and whether it suggests verification steps for key claims. Even if you never write that checklist down, you can apply the mindset. If the model summarizes an incident, you look for what it is basing the summary on, and you look for places where it might have guessed. If it proposes a mitigation, you check whether that mitigation fits your environment and whether it is consistent with your policies. This is how you keep the model helpful while still treating it as a fallible tool. Grounding, constraints, and verification patterns also work together, and the best designs use all three. Grounding gives the model facts to work with, constraints prevent it from filling gaps with fiction, and verification catches mistakes that still slip through. If you only ground without constraints, the model may still invent details beyond the provided context. If you only constrain without grounding, the model may respond with vague statements that are not useful. If you only verify at the end, you may waste time checking a long answer that could have been safer from the start. The most practical approach is to build safety earlier in the process, so the model's first draft is already close to what you can trust. The last misconception to clear up is the idea that you can eliminate hallucinations entirely. In practice, you aim to reduce them to a level that matches the risk of the task, and you build processes that prevent a hallucination from becoming an action without human or system checks. This is the same approach we take with any automation. We do not assume perfection. We assume failure is possible and design for it. When you ground the model, constrain its claims, and apply verification patterns, you are building a controlled environment where the model's strengths are used and its weaknesses are contained. That is what practical AI security looks like at the beginner level, and it is the foundation for everything else you will learn. By the time you finish this episode, the big takeaway should feel almost simple. Do not ask the model to guess. Do not reward it for sounding certain, and do not treat its confidence as proof. Give it real context, limit what it is allowed to claim, and check what matters before you rely on it. If you do that, hallucinations become less of a scary mystery and more of a manageable engineering and process problem. You are building a habit of grounding and checking, which is exactly the habit that keeps security programs stable when new tools are added. That habit will also help you in the next topics where we talk about confidence, escalation, and safe output handling, because all of those depend on the same core idea. Separate what is known from what is merely plausible, and then act accordingly.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.